The evolution of Batman's suit through the years. Full lore. Welcome, wanderer, to the quiet of the Batcave in the hours before dawn, when the suit hangs still on its stand, and the city above breathes in its complicated way, and there is finally time to consider what the suit actually is. Not armour exactly, not costume exactly, but the physical argument that one man has been making against the darkness for decades, revised and refined and remade in response to every lesson the darkness has taught him. Tonight we trace that argument from its first desperate improvisation to the fully realised symbol it became, following the suit's evolution through every iteration, every material, every design choice that moved it closer to what it needed to be. So settle in. The cave is quiet. Let the story carry you gently into sleep. Before the suit existed, there was a problem, and the problem was this. Bruce Wayne was a man. This sounds obvious, but it was the foundational difficulty around which everything that followed was organised. The constraint that every design choice the suit would eventually embody was made in response to. He was a man of exceptional training and exceptional capability, an absolute commitment to a mission whose scope was, if examined honestly, beyond what any individual human being could reasonably expect to accomplish. Gotham City was a place that had been generating crime and suffering, and the specific institutional failures that allowed both to persist for decades before Bruce Wayne decided to do something about it. And the doing something about it required more than a highly trained person moving through the city's nights with the best intentions available. It required something that operated on a different level than the individual, that transformed the individual into a symbol, that made the presence of a single man in a dark alley into something that could not be processed through the normal categories of threat assessment that a criminal's experience had developed. The Bat came to Bruce through the specific alchemy of trauma and memory, and the particular susceptibility that a man who has been working toward a single purpose for years develops to the signs that might indicate how to serve that purpose. He sat in the study at Wayne Manor, planning his first nights and finding in every plan he made a version of himself that was insufficient to the task. Capable, committed, present, and insufficient. The person was not enough. The mission required more than the person. And then a bat came through the broken window and everything that had been unresolved found its form. The choice of the bat as symbol was not arbitrary and was not purely aesthetic, and deserves to be understood as the specific tactical decision that it was. Human beings have an instinctive aversion to bats, not a reasoned aversion, not the kind that can be argued with or overcome through the application of rational reassurance, but the deeper kind that operates below the level of deliberate thought, that activates in the presence of winged things moving in peripheral vision in low light, that connects to ancient reflexes about things that move in darkness, and that carry specific associations of the uncanny and the threatening. Bruce was not simply choosing an animal that he liked, or that he found personally meaningful, though those dimensions were also present. He was choosing a psychological weapon, something that would work on the people who encountered him at the level of instinct rather than reason, that would make the fight harder for their rational minds to win against their reflexive fear. The first suit was built from what was available and what was needed in that order. The grey bodysuit provided the foundational layer, close enough to the body to not impede movement, dark enough to lose clarity and shadow, simple enough in construction to allow for the full range of motion that the work demanded. Movement was the non-negotiable requirement. A suit that limited the fighter's mobility was a suit that got the fighter killed, and everything else in the design had to accommodate this fundamental constraint. The grey colour, which many subsequent versions would retain and others would abandon in favour of deeper blacks, served the specific function of camouflage in the specific conditions of Gotham's nights. Not the camouflage of jungle or desert or Arctic environments, but the urban camouflage of a city that was neither fully lit nor fully dark, that operated in the specific grey ambient illumination of streetlights filtered through overcast sky, in which pure black would have registered as a shape against the lighter background rather than dissolving into it. The cowl was the suit's most essential element, and its most complex design problem. It needed to accomplish several things simultaneously that were in tension with each other. It needed to conceal Bruce Wayne's identity completely, not approximately, not partially, but completely, in the specific way that concealment needs to be complete, when the alternative is the destruction of everything the suit was built to protect. It needed to extend the bat imagery upward into the silhouette in a way that made the overall figure read as something other than simply human, that added the vertical dimension that made the shape alarming in peripheral vision and in the specific compressed way that threat perception operates in people who encounter the suit in high-stress situations. And it needed to allow Bruce to see clearly, and to hear clearly, and to breathe without restriction, and to move without the cowl shifting or obscuring his vision at moments when obscured vision was the difference between functional and compromised. The ears in the first suit were not as long as they would eventually become across decades of refinement, but they were present from the beginning because they were doing essential work from the beginning. The bat's ears, the way they extended the silhouette upward into points that human beings do not have, were doing something specific in the psychology of the people who encountered Batman in darkness. Human beings read silhouettes rapidly and with significant accuracy, extracting from the outline of a shape information about what it is and whether it poses a threat. A human silhouette is recognizable and therefore processable. The brain identifies it as human and routes the threat assessment through the frameworks appropriate to a human opponent. A silhouette with something wrong about it, something in the proportions that doesn't resolve into the expected human outline, delays that routing, forces the perceptual system through an extra step of uncertainty before it can arrive at an assessment, creates in the interval between stimulus and processed response the specific opening in which fear can establish itself before the rational mind has closed the gap. The cape presented its own set of design problems that the first version solved imperfectly, and that subsequent versions would refine across decades. The cape needed to be long enough and wide enough to accomplish the visual purpose of making Batman's silhouette read as something vast and winged when fully extended, the specific image of a bat in flight, with all the associations that image carried, was the visual argument the suit's designers were trying to make, and the cape was the element that made the argument most completely. But a cape that was long enough and wide enough for this visual purpose was also a cape that was heavy and that created drag and that could catch on things, and that in a dozen practical ways made the physical work of fighting and climbing and moving through the city's architecture more difficult. The first cape managed this tension inadequately, and was the element of the first suit that required the most subsequent revision. But the tension itself was never fully resolved, only managed with varying degrees of success across different versions, because the cape was doing two things that were not entirely compatible. The utility belt was, from the first night, perhaps the most practically significant element of the suit, though it received less of Bruce's design attention in the earliest phase because it was the element whose function was most immediately obvious. A fighter who operates alone in environments that can present any challenge needs to carry the tools that might address any challenge they could anticipate encountering. The specific set of tools that the first belt contained was the product of Bruce's assessment of what Gotham's knights were likely to require of him, filtered through the constraints of what could be carried on a belt without making the belt itself unwearable. The batarang, the throwing weapon that was simultaneously offensive tool and retrieval implement, that could stun and distract and could be recovered after use, was present from the beginning. The grappling hook that would make Gotham's vertical geography navigable, that would make a man who could not fly capable of moving through the city's three-dimensional space with something approaching the freedom that the bat imagery implied, was present from the beginning. The handcuffs, the forensic tools, the first aid materials, all of these were present from the beginning in their earliest forms because the work required all of them. What the first suit could not do is as important to understand as what it could do, because the history of every subsequent iteration is the history of the first suit's limitations being identified through operational experience and addressed through design revision. The first suit provided almost no protection against ballistic impact. It was cloth, or close to cloth, and a bullet fired at close range would pass through it as though it were not there. The first encounters that involved armed opponents taught Bruce this with the specific authority that operational experience provides, and the lesson was incorporated into every subsequent version's design priorities. The first cowl was rigid enough to protect the head against blunt impacts, but not against sustained concentrated force. A strong enough impact in the right location would defeat it. The first cape's material was not fire-resistant in any meaningful way. The first gloves provided grip and some protection to the hands, but nothing like what armoured gloves would eventually provide. These limitations were not failures of vision. They were the failures that any first version of a complex system produces when the system is being built before the designer fully understands what the system will be asked to do, before the operational conditions have had the chance to reveal what the design assumptions got wrong. The first suit was built by a man who had trained for years for a mission he could not fully define in advance, who had equipped himself for threats he could not fully anticipate, who was operating on a theory of what the work would require that the work itself would have to validate or refute. The limitations were the places where the theory was wrong, or where the theory was right but the execution was inadequate to the requirements the theory had correctly identified. And each limitation, identified through experience, became the specification for the next version's improvement. The suit that Bruce wore on the first night was the roughest draft of an argument he's been refining ever since. The argument that a person who has suffered enough loss to understand what loss costs, and who has developed sufficient capability to do something about what causes loss, can put on a suit and stand in the dark and make the darkness a little less safe for the things that prey on others within it. The suit was imperfect. The suit was always going to be imperfect. Perfection was not the goal and was not achievable. What was achievable was something better than what had existed before, something that made the mission more possible than it would have been without it, something that could be improved in response to what the mission taught about what it required. The first suit was the beginning of that process. Everything that came after was its continuation. The argument started on that first night is still being made in whatever the current version of the suit is wearing, wherever the current version of Batman is standing in the dark above Gotham, patient and still and undefeated by everything the city has sent against it. The years that followed the first night produced something that the first night's improvisation could not have anticipated. An iterative process of revision so sustained and so methodical that it constituted, across the decades of the Golden and Silver Age, a kind of ongoing engineering project conducted in parallel with the operational work that was simultaneously revealing what needed to be engineered. Each encounter taught something. Each thing taught became a specification. Each specification became a design change, and the accumulated design changes, layered across years of operational experience and the specific lessons that only surviving difficult situations can provide, produced a suit that was substantially different from where it had started, while retaining the core visual grammar that the first night had established as non-negotiable. The scalloped fins on the gloves arrived through a logic that was simultaneously practical and aesthetic, the two dimensions of the suit's evolution that were always in conversation with each other and that were never entirely separable. The practical dimension was this: in close combat, a fighter's forearms and wrists were exposed to impacts and grabs that the glove's basic construction could not fully address, and the addition of rigid projections along the outer edge of the glove and forearm created both a defensive surface that could be used to block and redirect strikes, and an offensive element that could be pressed into service as a raking weapon against opponents who were too close for conventional striking techniques to deploy effectively. The fins were a solution to a specific tactical problem that close combat in confined urban environments generated repeatedly. The problem of what to do when the distance between you and your opponent collapsed to the range where the conventional tools of the trained fighter became difficult to apply cleanly. The aesthetic dimension was this: the fins extended the suit's visual language of the inhuman downward from the cowl and the cape into the details of the extremities, making even the hands and forearms part of the overall argument that the suit was making about what kind of thing was wearing it. A man's hands are among the most humanizing things about him. We read intention and character and emotion in hands with a specificity that other body parts do not provide, and hands that reach out of a suit that is otherwise visually alien reassert the human underneath in ways that undermined the suit's broader argument. The fins interrupted this reading, made the hands part of the creature rather than the person emerging from it, extended the bat imagery into the contact points where the suit most directly engaged with the physical world. They were, in the way that the best design choices always are, simultaneously the right practical answer and the right aesthetic answer, doing both things at once with an economy of means that revealed the quality of the thinking behind them. The cowl's evolution across the Golden and Silver Age deserves sustained attention because it was the element of the suit that was doing the most psychological work, and that therefore required the most careful ongoing refinement to keep doing that work as effectively as the work demanded. The years grew longer across this period in a way that happened gradually enough that no single change felt dramatic, but that produced, across the accumulation of years, a silhouette substantially more imposing and more alien than the first versions had managed. The logic of longer ears was the logic of vertical extension. The way that adding height to a human silhouette without adding recognizable human anatomy triggers the specific perceptual confusion that the suit was designed to create. The way that shapes which are almost human but not quite activate threat assessment processes differently than shapes that are clearly human or clearly not human. There was a specific range of ear length that worked most effectively, a range discovered through the particular empirical process of visual artists drawing the character repeatedly and finding, through the accumulated evidence of what worked and what didn't in specific compositional and lighting contexts, where the ears needed to be to produce the desired effect. Too short and the ears read as decorative rather than as genuinely altering the silhouette's character. Too long and they became cartoonish, sacrificing the genuine menace of something just slightly wrong in favour of an exaggeration that resolved the viewer's perceptual uncertainty too quickly by making the wrongness obvious rather than subliminal. The effective range was the range in which the ears were long enough to disrupt the silhouette's resolution into the clearly human category without being so long that they pushed it into the clearly fantastical category instead. Finding and maintaining this range was one of the ongoing calibration challenges of the suit's visual evolution. The white eye lenses represent one of the suit's most psychologically sophisticated design choices, one that arrived not in the first suit, but in the early years of its refinement, and that has persisted across virtually every subsequent version, because what it accomplished was so precisely right that the various pressures toward removing it, practicality arguments, actor visibility arguments, director preference arguments, have never been sufficient to overcome the cumulative case for its retention. Human beings read each other primarily through faces, and within faces primarily through eyes. The eyes are the element of the human face that communicates the widest range of information with the greatest efficiency: intention, attention, emotion, the specific quality of engagement that tells us how another person is present with us in a given moment. When we can see another person's eyes, we have access to information that allows us to predict their behaviour with a precision that eyeless faces do not provide, and that predictive access is deeply comforting in the specific way that all predictability is comforting in the presence of potential threat. Replacing the eyes with blank white lenses removed this access entirely. The figure wearing the cowl with white lenses could not be read in the way that humans are read, could not have its attention tracked, could not have its intention inferred, could not be assessed through the channels that human beings use to assess each other in situations of potential confrontation. This was disorienting in a way that operated below the level of deliberate thought, that made the suit more frightening not because white lenses are objectively frightening, but because they remove the perceptual access that reduces fear of the unknown, leaving the unknown intact and therefore leaving the fear intact. The person wearing the lenses could see perfectly well through them. The people facing the person wearing the lenses could not tell where the gaze was directed, could not know whether they were being watched or not being watched, could not find in the eyes the information that eyes normally provide about what to expect next. The cape's evolution across the Golden and Silver Age was driven by two competing imperatives that the suit's designers were attempting to satisfy simultaneously and that could never be fully reconciled: the visual imperative and the functional imperative. The visual imperative said that the cape needed to be large enough and shaped correctly enough to produce the bat-in-flight image when extended, to make the silhouette of Batman with cape spread into the compositionally powerful thing that it became, and that served the suit's psychological purposes most effectively. The functional imperative said that a cape large enough and shaped correctly enough for the visual purpose was going to create problems: drag, weight, the liability of a fabric attached to the wearer's back that an opponent could grab, that would make the physical work of operating in it more difficult. The specific shape that the cape eventually settled into across this period was the bi-level design with the scalloped lower edge, the shape that referenced the wing of a bat not abstractly, but with genuine anatomical specificity. The way the scalloping recalled the membrane stretched between the elongated finger bones that forms the bat's wing, the way the bi-level structure created the specific visual effect of the cape as wing when spread. This was a design that served the visual imperative extremely well, producing an image that was instantly recognizable and compositionally dramatic in exactly the ways the suit needed it to be. It served the functional imperative imperfectly, as all cape designs across all iterations have served it imperfectly, because the functional challenges of a large attached fabric are not design problems that can be fully solved. They can only be managed. The yellow oval is perhaps the most discussed and most contested single design element in the suit's history, the one that has been removed and restored most frequently across different iterations, and that has generated the most sustained disagreement about whether it belongs. Its addition in the early years of the Silver Age was motivated by considerations that were partly practical, and partly aesthetic, and partly the specifically institutional consideration that the suit needed to function as a brand as well as a symbol, that it needed to be legible at distance and in poor light in the way that any effectively designed logo needs to be legible at distance and in poor light. The black bat symbol on the grey chest of the original suit was excellent as a symbol, but limited as a brand because it required favourable lighting and proximity to read clearly. The yellow background of the oval made the bat symbol visible from distances and in conditions where the original would have dissolved into the grey of the surrounding fabric. The canonical story that was eventually developed to explain the oval within the fiction was that it served as a deliberate target, a high visibility zone positioned over the chest armour that was designed to draw gunfire toward the most protected area of the suit, steering shots away from the unprotected face and toward the body armour that could absorb them. This explanation was elegant because it transformed what might have seemed like a purely aesthetic choice into a demonstration of tactical intelligence, the kind of thinking that characterized Bruce Wayne's approach to every design element of the suit. Whether the explanation preceded the design choice or was developed to account for it retrospectively is less important than the fact that it existed and that it was coherent. The suit could accommodate it, the logic held, and it added a dimension to the oval's presence in the design that the purely aesthetic explanation could not provide. The relationship between the suit and the Robins, the way that the addition of a partner to the mission altered what the suit needed to accomplish, and therefore began to alter its design, is a thread in the suit's evolution that is easy to overlook because its effects were indirect rather than immediate. The suit was not redesigned when Dick Grayson became Robin, did not immediately acquire new capabilities in response to the change in the operational situation, but the presence of a partner changed the context within which the suit operated in ways that accumulated across the years into design pressures that eventually influenced specific elements. The solo intimidation that had been the suit's primary psychological mechanism operated differently when the figure accompanied by a brightly costumed child who was visibly human and visibly young. The contrast between Batman's visual argument and Robin's visual argument was itself a form of psychological complexity that the suit needed to be able to function within. The material limitations of the era deserve acknowledgement because they constrain what the suit could ever have been in this period, regardless of the sophistication of the design thinking behind it. The fabrics available, the manufacturing techniques available, the material science of the period, all of these placed a ceiling on what could be achieved in terms of protection and function that no amount of design intelligence could exceed. The suit could be made of the best available materials while still being limited in ways that later materials would make obsolete. Bulletproof fabric did not exist in the forms it would later exist. Lightweight, rigid materials with the strength-to-weight ratio required for effective body armour were not available. The suit's designers were working within constraints that would only be lifted as the relevant technologies developed, and the subsequent history of the suit is partly the history of those technologies developing and being incorporated into the design as they became available. Neil Adams arrived at Batman in the late 1960s with a visual intelligence that was rare even among the extraordinarily talented artists who had worked on the character before him, and what he brought was not simply a new drawing style, but a fundamentally revised understanding of what the character's visual presentation was supposed to accomplish and how the suit served that purpose. The context of the Adams redesign is essential to understanding why it worked as completely as it did, and why its influence persisted so thoroughly across the decades that followed, because the redesign was a response to a specific problem that the character's visual identity had developed across the middle years of the 1960s, a problem that the Adam West television series had both exploited and intensified. The television series had taken the campy, lighter dimensions of the Silver Age comics and amplified them into a fully realised aesthetic of cheerful absurdity that served the specific goals of a 1966 television production aimed at a broad audience that included both children who could enjoy it straightforwardly and adults who could enjoy it as self-aware parody. Within its own terms, it was brilliantly executed, and the version of Batman it created was distinctive and popular and influential in ways that deserve genuine acknowledgement, rather than the dismissiveness they sometimes receive. But the television series' success had created a problem for the comics character that was independent of the quality of what the television series was doing. It had established in the popular imagination a version of Batman that was fundamentally incompatible with what the character, at his best and most essential, was supposed to be. Batman was supposed to be frightening, not in a campy, winking way that acknowledged its own theatricality with a smile, but in the genuine way that something that operates in darkness and that channels the specific imagery of the bat and the night is supposed to be frightening. The way that the original design had been frightening, before years of cultural evolution and television production values had domesticated the imagery into something more comfortable. Adams understood this. Adams understood that the suit's visual language was supposed to produce something genuine in the viewer, not something performed, and he redesigned the suit's presentation in the comics to restore what had been lost: the genuine darkness, the genuine menace, the creature of the night rather than the costumed hero who happened to dress like a bat. The elongation of the ears in Adams's treatment was the most immediately visible element of the redesign, and the one that most clearly communicated what he was doing with the character's visual identity. The Adams cowl featured longer, sharper ears than any previous version had managed, ears that created a silhouette that occupied the space between the elegant and the threatening, with a precision that shorter ears had never achieved. The sharp upward points did something that rounder, shorter ear designs did not. They created the specific visual association with the angular, aggressive geometry of a bat's actual ear shape, the peaked triangular form that real bats possess and that human beings have some instinctive, pre-rational response to. They made the silhouette more anatomically specific in its reference to the bat, and in doing so they made the visual argument of the suit more persuasive and more immediate. What Adams understood about the cape, and what his treatment of it established as the visual baseline for virtually every subsequent iteration, was that the cape's function was inseparable from the character's relationship to space, and specifically to the compositional possibilities that a large flowing fabric created in the specific context of a figure moving through or occupying an architectural environment. The bat-in-flight image that the cape produced when extended was not simply a reference to the bat. It was the resolution of a compositional problem, the creation of a visual element that made the entire figure legible as something mythological rather than merely superheroic. When Adams drew Batman with the cape extended and spread in the specific scalloped wing shape that his treatment established as definitive, the image that resulted was not a man in a bat costume. It was something that occupied the same visual space as heraldic imagery, as the great symbolic forms that human cultures have used to represent power and the uncanny. The darker colour palette that Adams employed was less a design choice than a restoration, a return to the deeper values that the suit's original design had understood as essential, and that the Silver Age had brightened away through the accumulated effect of the era's preference for saturated, legible colour. The Batman of the Adams era was visually heavier, more genuinely present in darkness, less cartoon and more shadow than the version that had immediately preceded him. The grey of the bodysuit was a specific weighted grey rather than the lighter version that had drifted into the Silver Age palette, and the black of the cowl, cape, boots and gloves was a genuine black that absorbed light rather than reflecting it in ways that made the figure look like it was made of coloured paper. The influence of the Adams treatment on every designer who worked on the character after him is not simply the influence of a talented individual, but of someone who had found the precise visual solution to the problem the suit's design was trying to solve. Subsequent designers did not simply copy Adams because they lacked originality. They worked within his vocabulary because he had found something true about what the suit needed to look like in order to do what it was supposed to do. And finding something true has a specific gravity that makes departure from it feel like a loss rather than a development. The designers and filmmakers and artists who came after Adams were always in conversation with his solution, either building on it or deliberately reacting against it, but always in reference to it as the point of departure. The Adams redesign said something about Batman as a character that the Silver Age presentation had stopped saying and that needed to be said again. That this figure was not comfortable, was not safe, was not something that could be encountered in a dark alley and felt okay about. The suit served this saying. The suit was always serving the character's essential argument, and when the character's essential argument had been lost, restoring the suit to its proper visual language was a significant part of what restoring the argument required. Frank Miller came to Batman with the specific sensibility of a writer and artist, who understood the character as fundamentally a noir figure, as someone who belonged to the tradition of damaged men operating in corrupt cities that American crime fiction had developed across the middle decades of the 20th century, and that superhero comics had never quite accommodated fully. The Dark Knight Returns arrived in 1986 at a specific moment in the character's cultural history, a moment when the character had been in continuous publication for nearly 50 years, when the Adams redesign had restored the darkness that the Silver Age had lightened away, and when the question of what Batman's story was actually about was due for the kind of confrontation that only a genuinely new and genuinely serious piece of work could provide. Miller's answer was that Batman's story was about a man who could not stop, not about a hero who chose to fight crime out of generosity or principle, in any abstract sense, but about a specific individual whose specific damage had made the choice not really a choice at all, who was going to do this regardless of what anyone thought about it, regardless of what the law thought about it, regardless of what the cost to himself would be, because the alternative to doing this was a form of self-betrayal that was simply not available to him. And the suit in The Dark Knight Returns was the physical expression of this understanding, the suit as the armour of someone who knew what they were doing and who had made peace with what it required. The armoured quality of the Dark Knight Returns suit was not simply a visual choice, not simply the visual equivalent of making Batman look more powerful and more imposing, though it accomplished both of those things. It was a statement about what the suit needed to be for a man of 55 returning to the work after a decade of retirement, for a body that had kept the damage of years of combat and that could not do what it had once done without the suit, providing the assistance that age and accumulated injury had taken away from the body itself. The suit in this story was doing work that the suit in the original story had not needed to do. It was compensating, was filling the gap between what the man could do and what the mission required, was carrying weight that the man's body could no longer carry unaided. This introduced a dimension to the suit's meaning that was genuinely new, and that subsequent designers and writers have returned to repeatedly. The suit not simply as the expression of a capable person, but as the instrument that makes capability possible despite limitation, the armour that stands between the mission and the mortality of the person committed to it. A younger Bruce Wayne could perhaps afford a suit that was more cloth than armour because his body could absorb what cloth could not protect against, could heal quickly enough from injuries that the suit failed to prevent, that the failures were manageable rather than catastrophic. An older Bruce Wayne could not afford this, needed the suit to protect him in ways that the suit's earlier versions had never needed to provide, needed the armour to be genuinely structural rather than primarily symbolic. The bat symbol on the Dark Knight Returns suit was large in a way that previous versions had not been large. It dominated the chest visually rather than serving as a detail within the chest's visual field. This bigness was both expressive and strategic. Expressive because the larger symbol communicated something about the version of Batman who wore it, the willingness to announce himself, to make the symbol unmistakable, to be a statement rather than a shadow. Strategic because at the scale Miller drew the character in the visual grammar he employed, a smaller symbol would have been lost in the overall impression of bulk and darkness that the suit's design created, and the symbol needed to be present and legible if it was to continue serving its identifying and psychologically weaponized function. Batman, Year One represented the opposite end of the same Miller logic. Instead of the armoured elder returning to a mission he could not abandon, the earliest nights of the first engagement with that mission, before the suit existed in its refined form, before the design thinking had been validated by operational experience, before the improvisation had been replaced by the considered. The origin suit in Year One is one of the most revealing versions of the suit in the entire history of the character's visual presentation, because it shows what was there before the design, the rough materials, the improvised construction, the visible gap between what Bruce wanted to accomplish and what he currently had the means to accomplish. Miller's treatment of the origin suit was deliberately rough, deliberately provisional, deliberately unlike the finished suit that readers already knew from decades of comics publication. The roughness was the point. The roughness communicated that the suit was something that got built over time, that was refined through use, that did not arrive fully formed from a design process conducted in isolation from operational reality, but developed in response to what the work itself taught about what the work required. Every version of the suit that came after the Year One origin suit was better than the Year One suit precisely because it incorporated lessons that the Year One suit had not yet had the chance to teach. The legacy of the armoured aesthetic that Miller established in The Dark Knight Returns extended far beyond the influence of that specific work on subsequent comics. It established a visual and conceptual possibility that filmmakers and game designers and animated series creators have returned to repeatedly because it solved something that the suit's design had always left partially unresolved. The cloth suit had always carried an implicit implausibility, the suggestion that a person wearing essentially fabric could survive the encounters that the mission regularly produced, absorbing punches from metahumans and gunfire from organised crime and the physical demands of the acrobatic work the suit required, and emerge from those encounters functional. The armour acknowledged the implausibility and addressed it directly, said that if this person was going to keep doing this, they needed something that could actually protect them, and made the suit's design answer the question that the cloth suit had been quietly asking for decades. Tim Burton's 1989 Batman arrived at precisely the moment when the character's cultural authority had been substantially restored by the Adams visual redesign of the 70s and by the literary seriousness that Miller's work had brought to the character in the mid-80s, and when the specific commercial and cultural appetite for a big-budget cinematic treatment of the character had finally reached the point where a major studio was willing to commit the resources that such a treatment required. The film was genuinely anticipated in a way that few superhero films of the era could claim. People wanted to see this, wanted to see the character that Adams and Miller had made serious again rendered in the specific way that cinema could render things, with physical presence and practical reality, and the specific weight of objects that actually existed in three-dimensional space. The suit that Bob Ringwood designed for the film represented the first attempt to solve a set of problems that the suit's entire prior history had never needed to solve, because the suit's entire prior history had been conducted on a flat page where the rules of material reality did not apply. On the page, the suit could be simultaneously perfectly form-fitting and perfectly concealing, could move with the wearer in any direction without restriction, could appear to be made of something with genuine structural integrity without that something having any of the properties that structural integrity in the real world entails. On screen, these contradictions became unavoidable. The suit needed to actually be something, needed to be made of actual material that had actual properties, and those properties needed to be reconciled with the visual requirements that the decades of comics publication had established as non-negotiable. The decision to construct the suit from moulded rubber and foam latex was the solution to this reconciliation problem that the available technology and the specific visual requirements of the film made most accessible. Moulded rubber could produce the suit's silhouette as a structural fact rather than as something dependent on how fabric fell or gathered. The muscles were built into the material rather than implied by the wearer's body underneath it. The surface texture was determined by the mould rather than by the weave of the fabric, and the result was a suit that looked essentially the same from every angle and in every lighting condition, because the look was inherent to the object rather than produced by the interaction of the object with its environment. This was enormously valuable for a film production that needed the suit to read clearly on camera across dozens of different setups, in lighting conditions ranging from the near-total darkness of the Batcave to the more conventionally lit conditions of indoor scenes. What the rubber suit sacrificed in exchange for this visual consistency was mobility, and the sacrifice was substantial enough to shape not only the specific action sequences of the film, but the entire approach to what Batman could do in those sequences, and therefore who he was as a character in physical terms. Michael Keaton could not turn his head within the cowl. The rigidity of the moulded rubber that made the cowl so visually precise also made it structurally inflexible in ways that prevented the basic head movements that human beings perform automatically and constantly without thinking about them. The choreography of every action sequence in the film was therefore organised around this limitation, working around the fact that the person wearing the suit could not track opponents with his head, and therefore needed to track them with his whole body, needed to position himself differently relative to threats than an unconstrained person would, needed to fight in ways that accommodated the specific restrictions of the suit. The all-black presentation of the Burton Batman suit was a departure from the grey and black comics original that was driven partly by the specific visual conditions of film production, and partly by the particular aesthetic sensibility that Burton brought to the character's world. The grey of the comic suit worked on the printed page because the flat reproduction of the colour on paper created the specific tonal relationship between the grey bodysuit and the black elements that the suit's visual design required. On film, in three-dimensional space, under the specific lighting that Burton's cinematographer was using to create the dark, expressionist visual world of the film, grey bodysuit might have created visual inconsistencies that black avoided, might have registered as lighter than intended in some lighting conditions, or as dirty, or as something other than the unified, serious visual statement that the film's design philosophy required. The all-black suit was cleaner in the specific visual language of the film, more aligned with the gothic darkness of the production design, more immediately legible as the nighttime predator the character was supposed to be. The addition of the yellow oval to the Burton suit's design reconnected the film version to the comic's visual vocabulary that audiences were already familiar with, provided the single element of colour that the otherwise monochromatic suit needed to give the bat symbol definition against the black field of the chest, and served the brand identification function that the oval had always served, making the symbol immediately readable at distance, in poor light, in the compressed viewing conditions that an action sequence created. The oval's presence in the film was one of the design choices that most clearly acknowledged that this was Batman, that the film was not reimagining the character's visual identity from scratch, but was adapting an established and beloved design for a new medium and a new set of requirements. The Val Kilmer era introduced the Batman Forever suit in 1995, and with it the design decisions that would generate more sustained discussion than perhaps any other single iteration. The nipples, specifically, which were built into the moulded rubber in a way that the Burton suits had not incorporated, and that the film's director Joel Schumacher apparently felt were appropriate, given his understanding of the character's relationship to imagery of the classical body. The nipples were the most discussed element, but not necessarily the most significant design change. The suit also featured the silver emblem replacement for the yellow oval, a more stylized bat symbol, and the overall aesthetic direction of a brighter, more theatrical visual world that the film was building toward. But the nipples became the reference point because they were the most obvious deviation from any functional logic, the design choice that most clearly prioritized aesthetic considerations, of a specific and contested kind, over any practical or thematic justification. The George Clooney suit in Batman and Robin in 1997 represented the logical endpoint of the direction that the Batman Forever suit had established, a further elaboration of the theatrical, neon-accented aesthetic that Schumacher had been developing, taken to the point where the distance from the functional, serious visual grammar that Miller and Adams had established was so complete that the suit was functioning in a different design vocabulary entirely. The gold accents, the further elaboration of the muscle detail, the overall visual sensibility of something that was performing Batman rather than being Batman. These were not failures of craft, but expressions of a coherent aesthetic vision that was simply incompatible with the understanding of the character that the most serious and most enduring treatments had established. The reception of the suit was inseparable from the reception of the film, and both told the same story, that when the suit stopped serving the character's essential argument, the character himself became unavailable. Christopher Nolan arrived at Batman with a specific philosophical commitment that shaped every decision the three films made, including and especially the decisions about the suit, and the commitment was this: everything in this story would have an explanation, and the explanation would be grounded in the kind of reasoning that a real person operating in a real world could actually have arrived at. This sounds simple, but its implications for the suit were radical. Every previous cinematic iteration of the suit had asked the audience to accept the suit as a given, to bracket the question of where it came from and what it was made of and who built it and how, in the same way that comic readers bracketed these questions, because the medium's conventions permitted and encouraged this kind of selective suspension of inquiry. Nolan's commitment said that this bracketing was not available, that the suit needed to be something that could be explained, that its existence required justification of the kind that plausible reality required, rather than the kind that genre convention permitted. The solution that the films developed was elegant in the specific way that solutions to genuinely difficult problems are elegant when they work, not by making the suit simpler than it needed to be, but by finding a real-world logic that could contain all the complexity the suit required. The Wayne Enterprises Applied Sciences division, and specifically Lucius Fox's role within it, provided the mechanism, a corporation with the resources to develop advanced materials and equipment, for military and law enforcement applications, whose prototype inventory contained objects that had been designed for purposes adjacent to what Bruce needed, and that could be appropriated and repurposed without requiring Bruce to design them from scratch. The suit was not invented by Bruce Wayne. It was assembled by Bruce Wayne from components that already existed for other reasons, and the fact of this assembly, rather than invention, was not presented as a limitation, but as a demonstration of the specific kind of intelligence the character possessed. The intelligence that looks at what exists and understands what it could become. The specific Wayne Enterprises component that became the foundation of the Batman Begins suit was identified in the film as a sonar technology demonstrator, a prototype suit designed to test materials and construction techniques for applications in military special operations, which had been developed to a sophisticated level of functional capability and then shelved because the specific application it had been designed for had not reached deployment for reasons unrelated to the suit's performance. The suit's materials were derived from this prototype, a Kevlar bi-weave construction that offered significant protection against ballistic impacts and against the kinds of blunt force trauma that close combat with armed opponents routinely produced, while being light enough to permit the mobility that the work demanded. The prototype had been designed for people who needed to move in it, and it had been designed well, which meant that Bruce was inheriting decades of engineering refinement rather than starting from scratch. The memory cloth cape was perhaps the single most conceptually original element of the Nolan suit's design, the element that most clearly demonstrated what the films were trying to accomplish by grounding the suit in functional reality rather than accepting the genre's conventions. Memory cloth was presented as a fabric whose molecular structure could be altered by an electrical charge, shifting from the flexible, draping behavior of ordinary fabric to a rigid, wing-like form that could sustain a controlled gliding descent. This was not a fantastical capability. The films went to some trouble to establish it as an extrapolation of real materials science, the kind of material that might plausibly exist within the reach of sufficiently advanced research conducted by a sufficiently well-funded laboratory. The controlled gliding it enabled replaced the vague understanding of the cape's aeronautical capabilities that previous versions had implied without examining, made specific and functional what had always been gestured at but never explained. What the memory cloth cape accomplished in the film's visual language was what the cape had always been trying to accomplish. The bat-in-flight image, the figure with wings spread, the connection to the creature whose imagery organized the suit's entire design philosophy. But it accomplished it through demonstrated function rather than through visual assertion, made the connection between the cape and the bat's wings something that the narrative had earned rather than simply assumed. When the cape deployed in Batman Begins and Bruce glided from a height above Gotham streets, the image worked in ways that the cape had always worked visually, while also working in a new way, the way of something whose function made sense, whose visual power was grounded in demonstrated capability rather than asserted through design. The Wayne Enterprises suit's limitations were treated in the film not as failures to be papered over, but as productive constraints that shaped the story and shaped the character. The cowl's rigidity prevented fluid head movement in ways that created tactical vulnerabilities. Bruce could not track opponents with his head alone, and needed to commit his whole body to directional changes in ways that a more mobile suit would not have required. The armor's protection against ballistic impacts did not extend to the joints and extremities in the same degree as the torso, creating zones of vulnerability that opponents who understood the suit's construction could exploit. These limitations were not bugs. They were the honest acknowledgement that any real suit built for these purposes would have limitations, and that a character who was defined partly by his intelligence and his adaptability would respond to those limitations by working around them rather than pretending they did not exist. The Dark Knight's upgrade represented the film's most direct engagement with the question of what iterative development of the suit over time would actually look like. Not the wholesale replacement of one version with another, but the targeted improvement of specific elements that operational experience had identified as inadequate. The modular construction of the revised suit was the central innovation, the shift from the single-piece design of the Batman Begins suit to a system of separate armoured plates that could be individually attached, detached, adjusted, and replaced. This was how military equipment actually evolved, through the incorporation of lessons from deployment into specific targeted improvements rather than complete redesigns, and the film's treatment of the suit's upgrade acknowledged this by making the specific improvements legible as responses to specific problems, The neck mobility solution was the upgrade's most symbolically significant element because it addressed the limitation that had haunted cinematic Batman suits since the Burton era and had become almost a defining characteristic of the way the suit constrained its wearer. The Dark Knight's revised cowl allowed Christian Bale to turn his head naturally, freed the neck from the rigid collar that the Batman Begins cowl had required, and made possible action sequences in which Batman could track opponents and respond to environmental threats with the fluid responsiveness that the character's capability required. The film acknowledged this improvement explicitly within the narrative. Lucius Fox's line about the neck movement being the thing that had been fixed, delivered with the specific dry satisfaction of an engineer who has solved a problem that was bothering him, made the suit's evolution a subject of the story rather than something that happened between stories. The sonar system that the suit incorporated in The Dark Knight was the upgrade's most conceptually ambitious element. The transformation of the suit's cowl from a passive visual and psychological instrument into an active sensor platform that could map environments through sound waves bounced from mobile phones across the entire city. The implications of this capability were not separated from the suit's development, but were made central to the second film's thematic concerns. The tension between the extraordinary power that such a capability represented and the question of what it meant for someone to possess and exercise that power over an entire urban population. The suit's upgrade was thus simultaneously a tactical advancement and a moral problem, a demonstration that what the suit was capable of was always in conversation with what the person wearing it should be willing to do, and that these two questions could not be separated from each other in any honest account of what the suit was for. The Bane fight sequence in The Dark Knight Rises was the most honest accounting that any cinematic iteration of the suit had ever provided of what wearing a suit made of physical materials and fighting an opponent of genuinely superior physical capability produced as an outcome. Batman lost. The suit failed to protect him from the specific kind of damage that a stronger, more skilled, more physically capable opponent could inflict, and the damage was shown in its full consequences. The broken back, the protracted recovery, the extended period of functional incapacity that resulted from the suit's inability to prevent what Bane's physicality was capable of delivering. This was the film's most direct statement about what the suit actually was, not a guarantee of survival or success, but a tool that improved the odds without eliminating the fundamental vulnerability of the person wearing it. The Batsuit's final appearance in The Dark Knight Rises, the version worn for the film's concluding confrontation, repaired and returned after the Bane defeat, was visually identical to what had come before but carried within the fiction the specific weight of a suit that had failed and been restored, that had demonstrated its limits and was being trusted again despite those limits. This is one of the most interesting things the films did with the suit across 3 installments. They showed what happened when the suit was not enough, and then they showed the suit being used again anyway, because the mission did not stop requiring it simply because it had proven fallible. The suit was imperfect, and the mission was necessary, and the answer to this combination was the same answer it had always been: keep refining, keep going, wear the suit until a better version of it can be built. The Batman. The animated series suit represents perhaps the most successfully resolved version of the design challenge that every iteration of the suit faces, the challenge of distilling the suit's essential visual argument into its most economical possible form, of finding the minimum set of design elements that will produce the maximum psychological and aesthetic effect, of removing everything that is not essential without removing anything that is. The specific constraints of animation, which required every frame to be hand-drawn, and which therefore created strong economic pressure toward design simplicity, turned out to be not obstacles to the suit's visual realization, but clarifying forces that drove the design toward the elegance that the suit had always been capable of, but that the relatively unconstrained medium of the printed comic had sometimes obscured with elaboration. Paul Dini and Bruce Timm arrived at the animated series' design language through a process of deliberate reduction, of asking for every visual element, whether it was carrying its weight, whether the suit would be fundamentally diminished without it, whether it was serving the character's essential argument or merely elaborating it without adding to it. The result was a suit design of remarkable economy that somehow managed to be more visually arresting than more elaborate versions, that communicated everything the suit needed to communicate with fewer lines and less detail than the comic's original had typically employed. The silhouette was clean and immediately readable. The colour relationships between the grey bodysuit and the black elements were simple and precise. The cowl's ears were long enough to do their psychological work without being elaborated beyond what that work required. The return to the grey and black colour scheme in the animated series was not simply a preference or a tribute to the comic's original, but a considered visual choice whose logic the series' design philosophy made explicit. The all-black of the Burton films had worked within the specific conditions that Burton's production design created. The darkness, the expressionist lighting, the gothic visual world that made pure black the natural colour for the character. The animated series was operating in a different visual environment, one in which the background environments were also dark, and in which a purely black figure would sometimes disappear into them rather than standing out against them. The grey created the tonal contrast that made the figure legible in any lighting condition, that made Batman visible in darkness in the way that darkness itself was what he was supposed to master rather than what he was supposed to disappear into. The Arkham games arrived in 2009 with a clear understanding of what they were inheriting from the accumulated history of the suit, and with a specific ambition to create a version that synthesized the most successful elements of multiple prior iterations, while adding what the specific medium of interactive gaming required. Rocksteady Studios understood that the suit in a game was not simply a visual statement, but a gameplay element, something that the player experienced from inside rather than observed from outside, something that needed to feel like it was performing functions rather than simply looking like it was designed to perform them. The Arkham Asylum suit was designed to communicate physical capability in the specific way that interactive media communicates it, through the texture and weight and responsiveness that visual design creates in a viewer who is simultaneously the person wearing the suit and the person watching it. The surface detailing of the Arkham suit was significantly more elaborate than any previous version had employed. A layered, textured surface that communicated structural complexity, that suggested the suit was made of multiple materials serving multiple purposes, that gave the eye enough to explore that the suit held visual interest from any angle and at any distance. This was in direct contrast to the animated series' design philosophy of elegant reduction, and the contrast was appropriate to the different demands of the medium. Animation's flat planes and simplified forms worked within the specific visual conventions of animation, while the polygonal geometry and texture mapping of three-dimensional game environments rewarded exactly the kind of surface complexity and detail that the Arkham suit provided. The suit's evolution across the Arkham games followed a narrative logic that the games developed carefully. Each suit change was motivated by story events that explained why the suit would have changed, prevented the changes from feeling arbitrary, made the suit's visual history a component of the character's history within the game's fiction. The Arkham City suit showed the wear and damage that a suit would accumulate across an extended campaign, conducted in a walled urban environment full of armed opponents, gave the suit the specific patina of use that made it feel like a real object rather than a permanently pristine costume. The Arkham Knight suit represented a different kind of change, a suit built for a more militarized operational environment, heavier and more armored than previous versions, reflecting the character's assessment of what the threats he was facing in that game's story required him to bring to the confrontation. The Arkham games' influence on comics design in the years following their release demonstrated something important about how the suit's visual identity evolved across media in the contemporary period. It was no longer a one-way process in which comics designs influenced other media's adaptations, but a bidirectional conversation in which successful designs in any medium could feed back into the comics. Elements of the Arkham visual language appeared in comics published in the years following the game's success, as artists and editors who had spent time with the game's version of the character found its specific visual solutions persuasive enough to incorporate into the printed page. The suit's history was now a cross-media history in a way that it had not been before the games arrived, and the games were contributing to that history with the same kind of authority that significant comics runs and significant films had contributed before them. The New 52 was DC Comics' sweeping continuity renovation of 2011, a decision to restart the publication history of the entire comics universe, with new first issues and revised continuities, driven partly by the publisher's assessment that decades of accumulated continuity had made the characters and their stories inaccessible to new readers, and partly by the opportunity to update the visual language of all the characters for the contemporary period. Jim Lee's aesthetic dominated the New 52 Batman, and Jim Lee's aesthetic was one of ornate, carefully detailed suits with textured surfaces and segmented construction that communicated a specific understanding of what superhero costume design in the contemporary era should look like. More armoured, more complex in its surface treatment, more suggestive of engineered construction rather than of fabric or uniform. The New 52 Batman suit featured a segmented, armoured construction with prominent surface lines that suggested the boundaries between different sections of the armour, a design language that drew on the visual vocabulary of the Nolan films and the Arkham games while pushing both in the direction of greater visual complexity. The suit read clearly as something built from materials with structural integrity rather than from cloth, something designed by engineers rather than tailored, something that existed in the visual world of technology and applied science rather than in the world of costume and symbol. This was appropriate to the general direction of the New 52, which tended toward more grounded, more realistic presentations of its characters' equipment and environments, but it came at a cost. Some of the symbolic clarity that the simpler Adams derived, design achieved was sacrificed to the visual complexity of the more elaborate construction. Ben Affleck's portrayal of an older, more worn-down Bruce Wayne in the Snyder DC Extended Universe films required a suit that could communicate this specific version of the character, someone who had been doing this for a long time, whose suit had been refined over many years of operational experience, whose visual presentation carried the weight of history in a way that the suit of a younger or newer Batman would not. The Batman vs Superman suit accomplished this through its specific material choices, the fabric-like texture that gave the suit a quality distinct from both the rubber of the Burton era and the Kevlar of the Nolan era, something that looked like it had been built over time through careful iteration, rather than assembled from existing components, or engineered from scratch in a single design process. The return to grey and black in the Snyder suit was a significant visual choice that reconnected the film version to the comics original in a way that the Burton all black had deliberately not done. The specific grey employed was a dark, weighted grey that aligned with the film's overall visual palette, the desaturated, low-contrast colour grading that the Snyder DC films employed consistently, while maintaining the tonal relationship with the black elements that gave the suit its visual structure. The shorter ears of the Snyder cowl created a silhouette that was deliberately more brutal and less elegant than the Adams-derived long-ear design that comics readers were most familiar with, communicating something specific about this version of Bruce Wayne, someone whose relationship to the bat imagery was less about the creature's elegance and more about its capacity for violence. The mechanical suit built for the confrontation with Superman was the Snyder film's most direct engagement with the precedent that Frank Miller had established in The Dark Knight Returns, the powered exoskeleton, the armoured augmentation that allowed a physically limited human being to operate against an opponent whose capabilities were otherwise entirely beyond the reach of any unaided human combatant. The specific design of the Snyder mechanical suit drew on the Miller precedent while adapting it for the visual language of contemporary blockbuster filmmaking, making it more geometrically precise and more visually elaborate than Miller's relatively rough-hewn page renderings, while maintaining the essential logic that Miller had established. A suit designed specifically for one confrontation, built to compensate for the specific disadvantage that the confrontation presented, representing the application of human intelligence and engineering to the problem of physical limitation. The Batman that arrived in 2022 asked its audience to accept something the character had rarely been permitted to be in a major studio production. Young, uncertain, still assembling the meaning of what he had chosen to become. Matt Reeves set his film in the second year of Bruce Wayne's operation as Batman, and that single decision about chronology reshaped every subsequent choice about what the suit needed to look like and what it needed to communicate. This was not the Batman of years of refined practice, not the veteran whose every piece of equipment had been tested and improved across a decade of nights. This was someone still learning what the work required, and the suit had to carry that inexperience visibly, had to look like something still becoming itself rather than something that had already arrived at its final form. The logic of a suit still in progress runs through every visual choice the film makes. Where other cinematic treatments had presented Batman's equipment as the product of unlimited resources deployed with total competence, the Pattinson version insists on scarcity and improvisation, even within the context of Bruce Wayne's wealth. The film asks a specific and grounding question. What would a young man with engineering aptitude and access to military surplus actually be able to build, working largely alone, in the span of 2 years, without the benefit of a company like Wayne Enterprises publicly or covertly supporting the project the way earlier film versions had imagined? The answer the film provides is a suit that looks assembled rather than designed, plated rather than seamless, built from components that read as sourced and repurposed rather than manufactured to a unified specification. The plating itself carries this logic in its texture. Rather than the smooth, sculpted musculature of earlier cinematic suits, the Pattinson armour presents as segmented and utilitarian, dark metal and treated fabric combined in a way that suggests function dictating form at every stage, rather than an aesthetic vision imposed on the material afterward. The plates sit like something bolted onto a base layer rather than grown organically from a single design concept, and this matters because it tells the audience, without needing dialogue to explain it, that this Batman has not yet had the years required to smooth his equipment into elegance. He has had the years required to make it work, and only barely that. The cowl follows this same improvisational logic. Where the Nolan films had grounded their cowl in a plausible military technology narrative, complete with corporate origin and boardroom procurement, the Pattinson cowl feels handmade in a more literal sense, something closer to what an individual working with limited outside help might actually produce. It sits lower and more crudely on the head than the elongated, refined silhouettes of the comics-derived tradition, and this reduction in visual sophistication is not a failure of design, but a deliberate choice that reinforces the film's central premise. This is a Batman still figuring out what the mask needs to do and how it needs to look, still working through trial rather than operating from an established template. At the centre of the chest sits the film's most narratively resonant design decision, the detail that critics and audiences return to more than any other element of the suit's construction. The bat symbol worn on the Pattinson suit is not simply painted or moulded in the manner of previous versions. Within the film's own account of its origins, the symbol is built from the very firearm used to kill Thomas and Martha Wayne, the weapon that created the orphan who would eventually become this version of Batman, transmuted directly into the emblem he wears across his heart every night he goes out into the city his parents' deaths indirectly shaped. This is a design choice operating simultaneously as narrative and as symbol in the most literal sense the character has ever received on screen. Every previous version of the Batman symbol has functioned metaphorically as a representation of the trauma that produced the character, an abstract shape that audiences understand to be connected to that founding violence without the connection being made concrete in the object itself. The Pattinson suit collapses that distance entirely. The instrument of the crime becomes the instrument of the response to the crime, worn on the body of the man that crime created, and the audience is asked to sit with the literalism of that transformation every time the camera holds on the symbol across Bruce Wayne's chest. The film does not allow this suit the invulnerability that so many previous cinematic and comics versions had implicitly granted their equipment. Where the general tendency across decades of adaptation has been to treat the suit as something that solves the problem of Bruce Wayne's mortal vulnerability, effectively removing the question of whether ordinary violence can hurt him once the suit is on, the Pattinson film insists on reintroducing that vulnerability as a live and consequential fact. There is a sequence in which Batman is shot at close range, and the film does not treat the impact as a moment of costume-enabled invincibility to be shrugged off in the next scene. The consequence registers. The suit absorbs the shot in the sense that it prevents immediate death, but the film makes clear that this is a suit doing the minimum required to keep its wearer alive, rather than a suit that has eliminated the danger of the work entirely. This treatment of the suit as something that mitigates risk without eliminating it aligns the film with a broader instinct in recent Batman adaptations toward taking seriously the physical cost of what the character does. But the Reeves film pushes this instinct further than most of its predecessors, making the suit's imperfection a recurring and visible fact, rather than a single acknowledged limitation early in the story that the narrative subsequently sets aside. The cape introduces the film's most technically ambitious departure from previous treatments of Batman's aerial capability. Rather than presenting gliding as an established and reliable tool the character has long since mastered, the film frames the wingsuit function of the cape as something closer to base jumping equipment, a controlled fall mechanism rather than true flight, requiring genuine risk and genuine physical commitment from the character each time he deploys it. The visual sequences built around this capability emphasize velocity and proximity to catastrophic failure in a way that earlier cinematic gliding sequences particularly the more graceful and controlled sonar cape sequences of the Nolan trilogy, had generally avoided. The Pattinson version of this capability feels dangerous in a way that previous versions had smoothed away, consistent with the film's overall commitment to presenting this Batman's tools as still carrying real risk rather than having been refined into safety. None of these individual design choices would register the way they do without the specific visual world the film constructs around them. Reeves and his cinematographer committed to a version of Gotham defined by near-total darkness and near-constant rain, a city photographed with a commitment to obscured visibility that few previous Batman films had sustained across an entire runtime. The all-black presentation of the suit, a choice with precedent stretching back to the Burton films of the late 1980s, finds a different justification in this visual context. Where the Burton-era black suit had been partly a practical solution to the challenges of moulded rubber and partly an aesthetic simplification for the sake of screen clarity, the Pattinson suit's blackness functions as camouflage within a specifically and deliberately underlit world. A suit built to become nearly invisible within the exact conditions the film insists on presenting for nearly its entire 3-hour runtime. The suit and the cinematography were designed in conversation with each other, each reinforcing what the other was trying to accomplish, producing a Batman who genuinely disappears into shadow, rather than merely being coded as a creature associated with darkness while remaining clearly visible to the audience throughout. Taken as a whole, the design represents a genuine synthesis of threads that had developed separately across the character's screen history, without ever having been combined quite this deliberately in a single treatment. The comics tradition's insistence on the bat as psychological weapon persists in the cowl's silhouette and the symbol's prominence. The Nolan trilogy's commitment to plausible function-first engineering persists in the plated, assembled quality of the armour, and in the film's general refusal to present the suit as effortlessly capable. The rough, improvisational texture of Frank Miller's treatment of the earliest Batman costume in Year 1 persists most directly of all, since the entire premise of a Year 2 Batman is a direct continuation of the logic that Origin Story established. A suit still carrying the visible marks of a project not yet completed, and yet the resulting design does not read as an assembly of borrowed elements. It reads instead as something specific to this particular telling of the character, shaped by a director's insistence on grounding the story in the emotional and physical consequences of a young man's decision to make his grief into a nightly practice, still working out what that practice requires him to wear. The gauntlets deserve their own attention within this design, because they carry forward a functional history stretching back to the character's earliest appearances, while updating that history to fit the specific combat philosophy the film establishes. Where many prior versions had presented the forearm blades and reinforced knuckles as essentially decorative extensions of a fighting style already assumed to be effective without them, the Pattinson gauntlets read as tools this Batman has learned to rely on precisely because his unarmed combat is still developing, still imperfect, still a work in progress rather than a mastered art. The film's fight choreography reinforces this reading directly. Bruce Wayne in this telling does not move like a martial artist who has trained for a decade under expert instruction. He moves like a large, strong, determined man who has taught himself to fight through repetition and through the specific brutality of trial rather than through refined technique, and the gauntlets function as compensation for that gap, hardware doing work that skill alone has not yet learned to do. This is consistent with the film's larger insistence that competence in this version of the character has not yet calcified into the effortless mastery that later iterations of the same character, operating years further into the practice, are generally permitted to display. The boots and the leg armour extend this same logic downward through the suit's construction, though the film spends comparatively little time drawing explicit attention to them. What can be observed simply from the way the character moves through the film's action sequences is a suit that limits speed and agility in exchange for durability, a trade the film seems to present as a genuine cost rather than a hidden strength. This Batman does not vault across rooftops with the balletic ease that the Arkham games or the more stylized comics treatments of the character generally grant him. He runs like someone carrying real weight, and the sound design reinforces this impression throughout, giving his movement a heaviness and a mechanical clatter that earlier, more graceful cinematic versions had generally smoothed away in favour of a more elegant silhouette in motion. The utility belt receives a similarly grounded treatment. rather than the vast and near-magical arsenal that some prior versions had implied without ever fully cataloguing on screen, the film's Batman carries a comparatively limited and specific set of tools, each of which the narrative makes functional use of rather than treating as background detail, establishing the character's general resourcefulness. The grapnel gun receives particular emphasis, its mechanism photographed with enough specificity that the audience understands its limitations as well as its capabilities, understands that this is a tool requiring precise aim and specific structural anchoring rather than a device that simply solves the problem of vertical movement through the city, however the story requires. This attentiveness to what the equipment can and cannot do is part of the same design philosophy that produced the vulnerable, imperfect suit at the centre of the film's visual identity, a consistent refusal across every piece of equipment to grant Bruce Wayne tools more capable than a genuinely young and still developing vigilante could plausibly have assembled for himself. The motorcycle that appears throughout the film's second half, standing in for the more traditional Batmobile in several key sequences, extends this same design vocabulary into the character's transportation, where the Batmobile itself, when it does appear, retains a genuine sense of engineered menace and power consistent with the resources Bruce Wayne can bring to bear on a single dramatic set piece. The motorcycle feels improvised and personal in a way that echoes the suit's own construction, a tool built for a young man moving through his city alone rather than a vehicle designed to announce institutional power. The visual continuity between the suit's assembled, plated aesthetic and the machine's own exposed functional construction reinforces the sense that everything this Batman uses emerges from the same underlying philosophy of scarcity, function, and self-reliance. Considered against the full history the previous sections of this outline have traced, the Pattinson suit occupies a distinct position. It is not attempting to be definitive in the way the Neil Adams silhouette became definitive, establishing a template meant to be returned to indefinitely. It is not attempting the totalizing armoured fantasy of Miller's Dark Knight Returns suit, built for a character who has already lived an entire life inside the identity. It is instead a suit built specifically to be outgrown, a version of the character understood as still becoming what he will eventually be, its rough edges and visible compromises the entire point, rather than a limitation to be smoothed away in the sequel that will presumably show a more practiced, more refined iteration of the same equipment. In this sense, the film's suit design accomplishes something few previous treatments had attempted with quite this level of deliberateness. It makes the incompleteness of the costume into the clearest possible expression of the incompleteness of the man wearing it, 2 years into a project that will, if the character's entire history across every previous medium is any indication, occupy the rest of his life. The film's treatment of the suit's maintenance carries its own quiet significance, even though the narrative never dwells on it directly through dialogue. What the production design communicates through the Batcave sequences, glimpsed rather than lingered on, is a workshop defined by improvisation, rather than the vast, gleaming, fully staffed facilities that previous cinematic versions had generally granted their Bruce Wayne. There is no Lucius Fox here supplying refined upgrades between appearances, no corporate research division quietly developing the next generation of equipment behind the scenes. The suit exists as something Bruce Wayne himself has built and rebuilds, alone, in a space that reads more like an obsessive's basement operation than a superhero's command center. This absence of institutional support is not incidental to the design philosophy the suit expresses. It is central to it. Every scuffed plate and every visible weld line becomes legible as the product of a single person's limited time and limited hands, working through the night on equipment that must simultaneously serve as his protection and as the ongoing record of everything he has not yet figured out how to do better. This isolation extends to the way the film frames Bruce Wayne's relationship to his own competence as an engineer and technician, which the suit's construction makes visible without the film needing to state it outright. He is clearly capable, clearly intelligent, clearly resourceful enough to have assembled something that functions under real pressure. But the film resists presenting him as a natural genius, whose equipment simply works because he wills it to. The suit's visible seams, the plates that do not quite match in their wear patterns, the sense throughout that this is version after version stacked and adjusted, rather than a single coherent design executed from a master blueprint, all communicate a character still discovering the outer edge of his own abilities through the specific method of building something, testing it against real violence and returning to fix what failed. This is a meaningfully different relationship between character and equipment than the one many previous versions had established, where the suit typically arrives close to finished, and the character's growth across the story is measured almost entirely in tactical and psychological terms, rather than in the visible evolution of the equipment itself. The reveal of the symbol's origin, discussed earlier as the film's most narratively loaded design choice, gains additional weight when considered alongside this broader picture of a suit built from constraint rather than abundance. A version of Batman operating with Wayne Enterprises' full resources behind him, of the kind earlier films had generally imagined, would have had no particular reason to incorporate a specific found object into his equipment. Every element of that Batman suit could plausibly have been manufactured to specification, sourced through corporate channels, produced without any need to repurpose what was already at hand. The Pattinson Batman circumstances make the opposite plausible and even likely. This is a young man building alone, drawing on whatever materials are available to him, and the film's decision to make the single most symbolically important piece of the entire suit a literal repurposed object rather than a manufactured emblem follows directly from the constrained, self-reliant portrait of Bruce Wayne the rest of the design has already established. The symbol's origin is not simply a striking narrative flourish layered onto an otherwise conventional design. It is the logical extreme of the same design philosophy governing every other visible choice, carried to its most emotionally direct conclusion. Read together with the 11 versions the preceding sections have traced, from the original grey and black improvisation, through Adams's definitive silhouette, through Miller's armour, through the rubber suits and the tactical suits and the animated and game iterations and the New 52 synthesis, the Pattinson suit represents something closer to a return than a departure. It reaches back past nearly all of the accumulated visual sophistication those decades produced, and asks once again the question the character's very first appearance had asked: what would this actually look like, built by this particular person, under these particular constraints, in service of this particular need? The suit that answers that question in 2022 is rougher, darker, and more visibly dangerous to its own wearer than almost anything that had preceded it, and that roughness is precisely the point. It is a suit still becoming an argument rather than a suit that has already finished making one, and its incompleteness is what makes it, for many who encountered it, one of the most emotionally legible versions of the costume the character has ever worn on screen. There is a particular kind of genius embedded in the decision to give a man no powers a belt instead of an origin story built around abilities. Every other figure operating at Batman's level in the wider fictional universe he inhabits carries some inherent capacity that exceeds what an ordinary body can do. Bruce Wayne carries a belt. The belt is the answer to the fundamental design problem the character was built to solve, which is how a person without enhanced strength, without flight, without any of the conventional trappings of the genre, could nonetheless function at the centre of a genre built almost entirely around those trappings. The solution was never to make Bruce Wayne stronger than other men. The solution was to make him more prepared than other men, to give him, quite literally, a portable answer to problems he could not have anticipated in advance, distributed across a series of pouches and compartments arranged around his waist so that whatever the night required, some tool already existed to meet it. This is worth sitting with for a moment, because it explains something essential about why the belt occupies the specific narrative and design weight that it does across every version of the character that has ever existed. A hero who can simply overpower any obstacle does not need a belt in any meaningful sense. Strength solves the problem strength was built to solve. But a hero whose entire premise rests on outthinking, outpreparing, and outlasting threats that could kill him in a single unlucky encounter needs something else entirely, needs a physical embodiment of preparation itself. And the belt became that embodiment almost from the character's earliest appearances. It is not simply where Batman keeps his things, it is the specific object that makes the entire premise of the character coherent, the proof carried on his own body that intelligence and foresight can function as a substitute for the powers he does not have. The Batarang holds a particular place within this system, as the tool most closely associated with the character, across every medium he has appeared in, and its history reflects the same pattern of incremental refinement that the suit itself underwent across the decades. The earliest versions were little more than sharpened, bat-shaped throwing weapons, functional but unsophisticated, essentially a themed variation on a boomerang with no particular technological ambition beyond the basic mechanics of a thrown object finding its target. Over the decades, this simple concept accumulated complexity the way every other element of Batman's arsenal did, driven by writers and designers looking for new ways to demonstrate the character's resourcefulness. Explosive variants appeared, capable of detonating on impact or on a delay. Electrical variants appeared, designed to disable machinery or stun an opponent rather than simply strike them. Remote-guided variants appeared in some of the more technologically ambitious iterations, batarangs capable of curving through the air toward a target rather than travelling only along the straight line the initial throw established. Different eras and different creative teams have emphasised different generations of this tool, and the specific batarang design carried by any given version of the suit tells its own small story about how sophisticated that particular Batman's operation has become, and how much technological support stands behind him at that point in his development. The grappling hook occupies an even more central place in the character's practical mythology, because more than any other single piece of equipment, it defines Batman's relationship to the vertical architecture of the city he operates in. Gotham, across nearly every version of its depiction, is a city built upward as much as outward, a landscape of towers and rooftops and fire escapes, and the specific kind of dense, layered urban geography that makes grappling and swinging a practical necessity, rather than simply a visually dramatic flourish. The earliest versions of this tool were exactly what the name suggests, a hook attached to a length of rope, thrown by hand and relying entirely on the thrower's aim and the hook's ability to catch on whatever ledge or protrusion presented itself. This basic concept persisted for decades before technology within the fiction caught up to what the character's operational needs actually demanded. The pneumatic grapnel launcher that appeared prominently in the Nolan trilogy represented a significant evolution of this idea, a compressed air firing mechanism capable of launching the hook with far greater range and far greater reliability than a hand-thrown line could achieve, effectively turning what had once been a somewhat improvised tool into precision equipment. Subsequent versions across games and later films have continued refining this same basic concept, introducing wire-based systems, multiple line configurations allowing for more complex swinging patterns, and increasingly sophisticated targeting systems that reduce the margin for error in split-second decisions made at considerable height above the street. The cape's technological history runs in close parallel to this same pattern of escalating sophistication, though its evolution follows a somewhat different trajectory because the cape always carried a dual burden that the more purely functional tools did not. It needed to work as a visual statement, the single most recognisable silhouette associated with the character, and it needed to work as an actual piece of equipment capable of providing some practical benefit beyond its symbolic function. Early versions of the character resolved this tension by leaving the cape almost entirely symbolic, a visually striking piece of fabric that provided concealment and a certain theatrical drama to Batman's movements, but that made no particular claim to functioning as genuine flight or gliding equipment. This began to change as writers and designers grew more interested in giving the cape an active rather than purely passive role. The memory cloth concept introduced in the Nolan films represented perhaps the most elegant technological solution to this problem within the character's fiction, a fabric that remained soft and pliable under normal circumstances, but that could be made rigid through an electrical charge, transforming instantly from cloak to wing and back again as the situation required. Other versions have approached the same basic problem differently, incorporating stiffened frames, mechanical extensions, or in the more science fiction-inflected iterations found in some of the characters' future-set stories, fully powered flight systems that abandon the pretense of gliding altogether in favour of genuine controlled flight. The cowl, more than any other single component of the suit, has absorbed the greatest share of technological ambition across the character's history, because the cowl is where Batman's information-gathering capabilities are most naturally housed. A character whose core competency is detection and analysis, as much as physical combat needs equipment that supports that competency directly, and the cowl has accumulated, across decades of incremental addition, an increasingly elaborate suite of sensory and analytical tools. Night vision capability appears in some form across nearly every sufficiently modern version of the suit, allowing Batman to operate effectively in the low-light conditions his entire operational philosophy depends on. Detective vision, most prominently associated with the Arkham game series though echoed in various forms across other media, represents an even more ambitious extension of this same basic idea, transforming the cowl into something closer to an active investigative instrument, capable of highlighting evidence, tracing bullet trajectories, and reconstructing crime scenes in ways that make the character's detective identity as mechanically active as his combat identity. Communications equipment, allowing coordination with Alfred, with various allies, and in team contexts with the wider Justice League, has become a standard feature of more technologically sophisticated versions of the cowl, transforming what began as a simple mask into something closer to a command and control platform worn on the head. The suit's forensic and analytical capabilities extend this same logic outward from the cowl into the broader equipment, carried across various points on the belt and the suit itself. More advanced versions of Batman's equipment have incorporated portable analysis tools capable of processing samples in the field, identifying chemical compounds, cross-referencing fingerprints and other identifying evidence against Batman's own extensive private databases, and generally supporting the detective half of the character's dual identity as a physical and intellectual force. This detective equipment rarely receives the same visual emphasis that the more overtly dramatic combat tools do, the exploding batarangs and the grappling hooks and the various armor plates, but its presence across the more thorough treatments of the character's equipment matters, because it reflects something essential about what actually distinguishes Batman from a simple armoured vigilante. The detection and analysis tools are the equipment of a character whose primary weapon has always been understood, across every serious treatment of the character, to be his mind rather than his fists, and a suit that neglected this half of his identity in favour of pure combat capability would be failing to represent the character as he has actually been understood across the majority of his history. What all of these systems share, considered together rather than individually, is a specific relationship to Bruce Wayne's ongoing assessment of the threats he expects to face. The particular selection of tools carried on any given night, in any given version of the character, functions as a kind of map of his current understanding of Gotham's dangers. A Batman anticipating primarily street-level criminal activity carries a different loadout than a Batman anticipating confrontation with meta-human threats or with other members of his own eventual superhero community, should they ever be compromised. This responsiveness, this capacity for the belt and the suit's other systems to shift and expand in direct relation to what Bruce Wayne currently understands himself to be up against, is perhaps the deepest expression of the design philosophy established all the way back in the character's very first appearance. The suit was never meant to be a fixed and final answer to the problem of crime in Gotham. It was meant to be a continuously updating hypothesis, revised each time new information about the nature of the threat arrived, and the belt, more than any other single element of the character's equipment, is where that continuous revision has always been most visible. The evolution of the belt's physical construction across the decades tells its own quiet story, alongside the tools it carries. The earliest depictions presented something close to a simple leather strap studded with pouches, a design that owed as much to the pulp adventure aesthetic of the era in which the character was created as to any careful consideration of what a working professional tool would actually need to look like. As the character matured across subsequent decades, the belt itself began to reflect the same design pressures that reshaped every other element of the suit, becoming more structured, more compartmentalized, more visibly engineered rather than simply strapped together. The scalloped, segmented belts that became standard across much of the character's more modern visual treatment reflect this shift directly. Each compartment sized and shaped for a specific category of equipment, rather than functioning as an undifferentiated series of pouches into which anything might be placed. This attention to compartmentalization matters more than it might initially appear to, because it reflects an underlying assumption about Bruce Wayne's relationship to his own equipment that runs through nearly every serious treatment of the character. He does not simply carry tools, he organizes them, categorizes them, maintains them according to a system precise enough that he can locate exactly what a given situation requires without hesitation, in darkness, under pressure, with seconds rather than minutes available to make the correct selection. The specific materials used in the belt's construction have shifted across eras in ways that track the broader technological ambitions of whichever version of the character is being depicted. Earlier treatments generally left the belt's material construction essentially unaddressed, a detail beneath the threshold of what the story needed to explain. More recent and more technologically minded versions, particularly those associated with the Nolan trilogy and its immediate successors, have taken care to suggest specific real-world materials and manufacturing processes, carbon fibre compartments, reinforced clasps designed to withstand impact without releasing their contents accidentally during a fall or a struggle, insulated linings protecting more delicate equipment such as electronic devices or chemical agents from damage during the kind of physical punishment the character's nightly activities routinely inflict on everything he carries. This shift toward material specificity mirrors the same broader cultural shift toward realism and plausibility that reshaped the suit itself across the same period. Audiences and creators increasingly interested in believing, even briefly, that such a belt could actually be built and actually function as depicted rather than existing, purely as a convenient narrative device, capable of producing whatever tool the plot happened to require. Non-lethal restraint equipment deserves particular attention within this broader system, because it reflects one of the character's most consistently maintained ethical commitments across nearly every canonical treatment of Batman regardless of medium or era. Unlike many other figures operating in similarly dangerous fictional environments, Batman has almost universally been depicted maintaining a firm refusal to kill, and his equipment reflects this commitment directly, rather than treating it as an incidental character trait unconnected to his practical toolkit. The handcuffs and other restraint devices carried across nearly every version of the belt exist specifically to support this ethical position, providing a mechanism for incapacitating and securing opponents that does not require lethal force to accomplish. Various eras have introduced increasingly sophisticated versions of this basic restraint technology, from simple mechanical cuffs through adhesive foam-based restraint systems capable of immobilizing multiple opponents simultaneously, each innovation reflecting the same underlying commitment to a version of justice that stops well short of execution, regardless of how severe the threat being neutralized happens to be. The relationship between the belt's evolving contents and the character's broader technological ecosystem within Gotham has grown increasingly explicit across more recent treatments, particularly in versions of the story that take care to establish Bruce Wayne's ongoing research and development process, rather than presenting each piece of equipment as simply appearing, fully formed whenever the narrative requires it. The most thorough treatments of the character across comics, games, and certain film adaptations have taken pains to show the belt's contents as the product of continuous experimentation and revision happening in the Batcave between the story's dramatized encounters, prototypes tested and discarded, existing tools refined in response to specific failures encountered during actual use in the field. This attentiveness to process, to the belt as something under constant active development rather than a static inventory, reinforces the same underlying philosophy discussed earlier regarding the suit as a whole, a comprehensive system understood not as a finished achievement, but as an ongoing project, endlessly revised in direct response to the specific and unpredictable dangers Gotham continues to present each time Bruce Wayne walks back out into the night. Considered against the broader arc traced across the preceding sections of this history, the belt and its extended systems occupy a position that the suit's outer shell, for all its visual drama, cannot quite claim on its own. The cowl and the cape and the plated armour are what audiences see first, what defines Batman's silhouette against Gotham's skyline, what every artist and designer reaching for a definitive visual statement about the character has instinctively reached toward. But the belt is where the character's actual philosophy of operation lives, where the abstract commitment to preparation over power becomes something concrete enough to hold in a hand, count in a compartment, replace after use. A viewer who understood nothing else about the character could look at the belt alone and understand correctly that this is a figure who has decided the only reliable defense against an unpredictable world is to prepare for more contingencies than any single night could plausibly present, and to keep preparing for more even after the night is over. This is why the belt has proven so durable a design element across every reinvention the suit itself has undergone. The cowl's ears have lengthened and shortened across decades. The cape has gone from simple cloth to memory fabric to powered wingsuit. The colour palette has shifted from grey to black and back again depending on the specific creative vision guiding a given era. But the belt's basic function, a modular, expandable system of tools arranged for immediate access under pressure, has remained essentially constant since its earliest appearances. Even the most radical reimaginings of the character, the alternate continuity and Elseworlds versions that the next section of this history will examine in detail, tend to preserve the belt's essential logic even when they discard nearly everything else about the suit's traditional presentation. A Batman built for space combat still carries a belt adapted to that environment. A Batman aged decades beyond his prime and supported by external armour still carries some version of the same modular tool system at his waist. The belt, more than the cape, more than the cowl, more even than the bat symbol itself, may be the single element of the suit that most consistently survives every reinvention. Because it is not really a costume choice at all. It is the physical expression of the character's founding decision that intelligence, foresight, and relentless preparation could stand in for the powers he was never going to have, and as long as any version of Batman continues to operate from that same founding premise, some version of that belt, however its specific tools and materials may have changed, will continue to ride at his side into whatever the night has waiting for him. The belt's design has never existed in isolation from the broader cast of characters who have, across the decades, adopted variations of Bruce Wayne's basic approach to equipment. Each of the Robins who has carried that title across the character's long publishing history has developed a belt reflecting not simply a scaled-down version of Batman's own equipment, but a genuinely distinct philosophy shaped by that particular Robin's own skills, temperament, and relationship to the mission. Dick Grayson's belt, in the various eras where he has operated first as Robin and later as Nightwing, has generally emphasized acrobatic support equipment, consistent with his circus background, tools calibrated toward a fighting and movement style, built on speed and aerial maneuver, rather than the blunt force durability that Bruce Wayne's own equipment increasingly emphasized as the character aged. Jason Todd's equipment, particularly in the character's later depictions following his return from death and his adoption of a considerably more lethal operating philosophy, reflects an entirely different set of priorities, weapons rather than restraints, equipment built for a version of the mission that has explicitly rejected the non-lethal commitment that defines Bruce Wayne's own belt. Tim Drake's belt, consistent with his character's emphasis on detective work and technological sophistication, has often been depicted as the most gadget-dense and analytically oriented of any Robin's equipment, closer in spirit to Batman's own detective-focused tools than to the more purely combat-oriented loadouts some of his predecessors carried. These variations matter because they demonstrate that the belt's core design logic, however consistent its basic function has remained, is not actually a single fixed inventory handed down unchanged from mentor to student. It is a framework flexible enough to be reshaped around whoever happens to be wearing it. Evidence that the underlying philosophy of preparation and adaptability the belt represents extends beyond Bruce Wayne himself into every version of the broader mission he eventually came to share. The practical engineering challenge of the belt deserves attention that the character's more visually dramatic combat sequences rarely allow it. A device carrying the sheer volume and variety of equipment that the more thoroughly catalogued versions of Batman's belt are depicted, holding presence genuine questions of weight distribution and physical practicality that some of the more technically minded treatments of the character have taken seriously rather than simply waving away as an unexamined convention of the genre. A belt loaded with batarangs, explosive charges, grappling equipment, restraint devices, forensic tools, and communications equipment carries real mass, and a design that concentrated all of that weight without consideration for balance would meaningfully impair exactly the kind of acrobatic movement and rapid combat response the character depends on. The more careful treatments of the suit, particularly in the more recent realism-oriented films and in the more technically detailed corners of the comics and games, have addressed this problem through distributed compartmentalization, spreading the belt's mass around the entire circumference of the waist, rather than concentrating it at any single point, and through material choices privileging lightweight but durable compounds over the heavier metals that an unconsidered design might have defaulted to. This is a small detail relative to the sweeping visual redesigns this history has spent most of its attention on, but it reflects the same underlying commitment to plausibility that has increasingly characterized the character's more serious adaptations, a willingness to treat even the belt's basic physical practicality as a problem worth solving rather than a convention worth ignoring. The Arkham game series, discussed in an earlier section for its broader contribution to the suit's visual language, deserves specific mention here for the way it handled the belt and its contents as an active gameplay system rather than a purely narrative or visual element. Across Arkham Asylum, Arkham City, Arkham Origins, and Arkham Knight, the belt's contents functioned as the direct mechanical vocabulary through which players interacted with the game's world, each gadget mapped to specific combat and traversal functions, each upgrade to the belt's contents translating directly into new player capabilities rather than simply new narrative possibilities. This integration gave the belt a kind of interactive legitimacy that no purely visual medium could achieve. A reader or a viewer can be told that Batman's belt contains an extraordinary range of situational tools, but a player who has personally selected the correct gadget in the correct moment to solve a specific combat or puzzle challenge has experienced that versatility directly, has internalized the belt's logic as something functional rather than simply asserted. The specific upgrade paths the games offered, allowing players to gradually expand and refine the belt's contents across the course of a given game's narrative, mirrored the belt's own in-fiction history of continuous revision and improvement, collapsing the distance between the character's decades-long process of equipment refinement and the individual player's much shorter, but structurally similar process of gradually unlocking new tools across a single game's runtime. The belt has also occupied a particular place in the character's relationship to merchandising and toy design that is worth acknowledging as part of its broader cultural footprint, separate from its narrative function within any individual story. Across decades of licensed toys, the utility belt has consistently ranked among the most reliably produced individual pieces of Batman merchandise, sold both as a standalone toy allowing children to imagine themselves equipped in the same modular, ever-ready fashion as the character himself, and as an included accessory bundled with action figures and costume sets. This commercial durability reflects something genuine about the belt's appeal that runs deeper than simple brand recognition. Unlike abilities that cannot be imitated, unlike the cape's more purely symbolic drama, the belt represents a fantasy of preparedness that translates directly into imaginative play. A child wearing a toy belt is not pretending to have powers he does not have, but is instead pretending to be equipped, ready, capable of producing a solution to whatever problem presents itself. And this particular fantasy has proven remarkably resilient across generations of the character's young audience, precisely because it requires no suspension of disbelief about superhuman ability, only the more achievable fantasy of being sufficiently prepared. Narratively, the belt's centrality to the character's operational capability has made its removal or theft one of the most reliable tools available to writers looking to strip Batman of his advantages and force a confrontation with what remains of the character once the equipment is gone. Numerous stories across the character's long publishing history have hinged on some version of this scenario. Batman separated from his belt, forced to rely on unarmed combat skill and raw intelligence without the extended toolkit that so much of his tactical identity depends on. These stories function as a kind of narrative stress test of the belt's actual importance to the character's core identity, and the fact that writers have returned to this scenario so consistently across so many decades suggests an underlying anxiety, productive rather than dismissive, about whether Batman without his equipment remains recognizably Batman at all. The most successful versions of these stories generally answer that question in the character's favor, showing a Bruce Wayne whose intelligence and physical training persist even when the belt does not. But the fact that the question needs answering at all speaks to how thoroughly the belt has become fused with the audience's understanding of what makes the character function, a piece of equipment so central to his operational identity that its absence reads as a genuine crisis rather than a minor inconvenience. Set against the equivalent tools carried by other figures across the wider superhero landscape, the belt's design philosophy stands out for its particular honesty about its own limitations. Other characters' equivalent devices frequently function as effectively limitless solutions, capable of producing whatever the story requires without meaningful constraint. Batman's belt, in its more carefully considered depictions, has generally avoided this trap, presented instead as a genuinely finite resource, a specific and countable inventory that can run out, that requires resupply, that forces its wearer into moments of genuine tactical calculation about which of a limited set of tools to deploy in a given situation, rather than simply reaching for whatever solution the plot happens to need. This finitude is, in its own way, as important to the character's core identity as the more visually dramatic elements of the suit ever were, a quiet reminder running underneath every appearance of the belt across every era that this is fundamentally a story about a man with real limits, doing everything humanly possible to compensate for the powers he does not have and never quite succeeding completely, and choosing to go back out into the night regardless. The relationship between the belt and Alfred Pennyworth's role within the broader mythology deserves its own consideration, because so much of the belt's actual maintenance and restocking, when the stories choose to depict this process at all, falls to Alfred rather than to Bruce Wayne working entirely alone. This detail matters more than it might initially seem, because it complicates the more purely solitary image of Batman as a lone inventor assembling his own equipment in isolation that some versions of the character, particularly the Pattinson film discussed in the previous section, have chosen to emphasise. In the more traditional comics continuity, Alfred functions not merely as a caretaker in the domestic sense, but as an active participant in the belt's ongoing development, someone with sufficient technical competence and sufficient trust from Bruce Wayne to handle the actual physical labour of restocking depleted compartments, testing new prototypes, and in some of the more detailed depictions, offering genuine engineering input on what the belt's contents should be. This collaborative dimension softens what could otherwise read as an uncomplicatedly isolating portrait of Bruce Wayne's relationship to his own equipment, suggesting instead a partnership, however unequal in terms of public credit, in which the belt represents not simply one man's obsessive self-reliance, but the product of a household built specifically to support that obsession, with Alfred as its quiet second architect. The belt's design has also had to contend, across various eras and creative teams, with the specific challenge of remaining visually legible within the constraints of whatever medium is depicting it. A belt whose compartments are too visually similar to one another risks becoming an undifferentiated mass on the page or on screen, indistinguishable pouches conveying nothing specific about what any individual compartment might contain. The more successful visual treatments of the belt across various eras have addressed this through subtle variation in compartment size, shape, and placement, allowing an attentive reader or viewer to develop an intuitive sense of the belt's internal logic even without explicit labelling. Larger compartments toward the front associated with more frequently accessed tools, smaller and more specialised compartments toward the sides and back, reserved for situational equipment less likely to be needed in the split-second circumstances that so much of Batman's fieldwork demands. This kind of visual clarity, easy to overlook precisely because the best versions of it function invisibly, represents its own quiet design achievement running parallel to the more overtly celebrated visual choices this history has spent most of its attention examining. Taken together, the accumulated history of the belt and the suit's other extended systems reveals something the more purely visual history of the cowl and cape and armour, examined across the earlier sections of this outline, cannot quite reveal on its own. The suit's outer shell tells the story of how each era chose to represent fear, how each generation of artists and filmmakers reimagined the specific silhouette that would make a criminal's blood run cold on a Gotham rooftop. The belt tells a different and in some ways more intimate story, the story of a man's ongoing relationship with his own limitations, the specific and continuously revised inventory of everything he has decided he cannot afford to be without, updated and refined across every single version of the character, precisely because the underlying problem it exists to solve, the problem of confronting an unpredictable and often overwhelming world without any power beyond preparation itself, has never actually been solved and was never going to be solved, only managed, night after night, one compartment at a time. Every version of Batman that has ever escaped the boundaries of the character's primary continuity carries with it a version of the suit reshaped by whatever circumstances that alternate telling has imposed, and these variations, considered together, function as a kind of extended experiment in which the constant elements of the design reveal themselves precisely because so much else has been allowed to change. Kingdom Come offered one of the most emotionally direct of these variations, presenting an aging Bruce Wayne who has continued the mission for decades, beyond what his body alone could sustain, and the suit Alex Ross designed for that older figure carries the specific poignancy of equipment that has shifted in function from weapon to necessity, from symbol to support structure. The armour in this telling exists not primarily to intimidate but to compensate, mechanically assisting a spine and a set of joints that have absorbed far more punishment than any human body was built to withstand, and the visual result is a suit that reads simultaneously as more imposing than any standard version, and as deeply melancholy, a monument to a man who has refused to stop even after every reasonable argument for stopping has accumulated against him. This is the suit understood not as the expression of youthful vigour channeled into symbol, but as the last available tool of a body no longer capable of the physical feats that made the symbol frightening in the first place, and the design communicates this reality without requiring a single line of dialogue to explain it. Batman Beyond pushed the variation in the opposite direction entirely, imagining not an aging Bruce Wayne clinging to a diminishing capability but an entirely new wearer, Terry McGinnis, operating decades into the future, with the benefit of technology that current fiction has not yet caught up to. The suit developed for this telling abandoned nearly every material constraint that had governed every previous version, becoming a fully powered exoskeleton capable of genuine flight rather than gliding, equipped with a level of integrated sensory and combat technology that no grounded present-day version of the character could plausibly claim. What makes this variation valuable within the larger history is not simply its novelty, but what it reveals about where the design's underlying logic was always heading. Every incremental technological upgrade traced across the preceding sections of this history, from simple grappling hooks to pneumatic launchers, from basic night vision to full detective vision overlays, points in the direction the Beyond suit ultimately arrives at. A fully realised expression of what Bruce Wayne's original design philosophy would produce, given sufficient time and sufficient advancement in the underlying technology. The Beyond suit is, in this sense, less a departure from the character's design history than its logical endpoint. The suit every previous iteration was quietly gesturing toward, without yet possessing the means to actually build. Alternate political and cultural settings have produced some of the more startling variations on the suit's basic template. Stories like Red Sun and its various counterparts that relocate the character entirely outside the cultural and historical context that originally produced him. These stories matter for this history, not primarily for their narrative content, but for what their design choices reveal about the relationship between the suit and the specific cultural moment any given version is responding to. A Batman built within a fundamentally different political framework, operating under fundamentally different assumptions about the relationship between the individual and the state, produces a fundamentally different suit, sometimes retaining the basic silhouette, while radically altering the ideological content that silhouette is understood to carry, sometimes abandoning even the silhouette itself in favour of something that better serves the alternate context's own internal logic. What these experiments demonstrate, taken together, is that the suit was never simply a fixed aesthetic object handed down unchanged across every telling. It has always been responsive to the specific anxieties and specific cultural assumptions of whatever moment and whatever context is producing it, a design vocabulary flexible enough to be redeployed in service of entirely different arguments, while still remaining recognisably continuous with everything that came before. The Hellbat armour represents perhaps the most extreme escalation the suit has undergone within any officially sanctioned continuity, a design developed specifically for confrontations that exceed anything the character's more grounded equipment could plausibly survive. Built in collaboration with the wider community of superhuman allies Bruce Wayne has accumulated across his career, and intended for use in environments, including the vacuum of space itself, that no earlier version of the suit had ever been asked to consider. The Hellbat abandons nearly every pretense of stealth or psychological intimidation that had defined the suit since its earliest appearances, becoming instead a piece of heavy combat armour, closer in spirit to military hardware than to a costume designed to frighten street-level criminals. Its existence within the character's broader mythology raises its own quiet question about how far the underlying design philosophy can be stretched before it stops being recognisably Batman's philosophy at all. A question the character's own writers have generally answered by treating the Hellbat as an extreme and temporary measure rather than a permanent evolution, equipment reserved for the rare circumstances that genuinely require it, and set aside again once those circumstances pass. The various suits Bruce Wayne has developed specifically to counter his own allies should they ever be compromised or turned against humanity, occupy an even stranger and more psychologically revealing corner of this design history. These contingency suits, built in secret and generally discovered by the very allies they were designed to counter, reflect a dimension of the character's relationship to his own equipment that the more straightforwardly heroic versions of the suit rarely acknowledge directly, a suspicion extending even to the people he trusts most, a conviction that no one, including the people closest to him, should ever be entirely beyond the reach of his preparation. The suits designed for this purpose tend to emphasize precisely the vulnerabilities of whichever ally they are built to counter, kryptonite-infused components for confrontations with uncompromised Superman, magical countermeasures for confrontations with more mystically oriented allies, each one a kind of dark mirror of the ally's own capabilities, rather than a straightforward escalation of Batman's usual equipment. These suits are rarely worn with anything resembling pride within their own stories, and their existence is generally treated as a source of genuine tension between Batman and the allies who discover them. But they belong within this history because they represent the design philosophy's most unflinching logical extension, the belief that preparation must extend even to the people you have chosen to trust, carried to its most uncomfortable possible conclusion. What all of these variations demonstrate, when considered together rather than as isolated curiosities, is that the elements of the suit's design that have persisted across every single one of these radically different contexts are precisely the elements that constitute the character's actual irreducible core. The specific material, the specific technology level, the specific color palette, even the specific silhouette have all proven negotiable, reshaped again and again to fit whatever story is being told. What has never proven negotiable, across even the strangest and most extreme of these variations, is the underlying philosophy the suit exists to express. The conviction that vulnerability can be answered not through the acquisition of power, but through the relentless, obsessive work of preparation. That a person without extraordinary ability can still stand between the vulnerable and what threatens them if that person is simply willing to out-prepare every danger that might arise. This is what survives even when everything else changes, the constant beneath every variation, and it is this constant, more than any single visual choice, that has allowed the suit to be endlessly redesigned across nearly 90 years of continuous reinvention without ever losing its essential identity. The Batcave grows quiet again, and the suit returns to its stand, patient in the dark the way it has always been patient, waiting for whatever the next version of itself will need to become. Across every decade this history has moved through, the suit was never really the point. It was always the argument the suit was making, the same argument repeated in 1,000 different materials and 1,000 different silhouettes, that a single frightened man standing in his father's study, watching a bat cross the window, could decide that grief did not have to end in helplessness, that a symbol built carefully enough and worn faithfully enough could become something other than a costume. Every refinement traced through these sections, every failed prototype and every quiet correction made after a bad night, belongs to that same unbroken decision. The suit changed because the city changed, because the threats changed, because the man wearing it aged and learned and occasionally failed and kept adjusting anyway. What never changed was the reason for putting it on in the first place. So let the cowl rest tonight, and let the cape hang still, and let whatever comes next arrive in its own time. The bat still watches over Gotham, and somewhere close by, if you have let yourself drift far enough into this story, so does something in you, held quietly in the dark, safe for now, ready for tomorrow.